So please join me in welcoming Forrest Shomer, our keynote guest.
Thanks, Reed. My story about Reed is, this is a local story. I went to the furthest place that I've been on the planet, Patagonia. And I wound up in a little town that's called Ojo. And I told them where I was from. They said, "Oh, do you know Reed?" He had actually been there before me. So we're connected in some, another way we're connected is the little permaculture dictionary that we produced in Spanish. It was something I was able to use as a gift to people that I became acquainted with while I was in South America. So, you know, reaching out far and wide, really a great thing. Before I start, there's one thing I want to do. I want to take your picture. So, smile. And that's because it's really good to photo document events like this, and I haven't seen a roving photographer yet, so I decided to be one. I don't usually like to read in front of a group, but this is so short. If you went to the website, you may have already seen this, but I took these words for inspiration on what I wanted to say tonight. And this is from a woman named Beth Garrigus, and she lives in New Mexico. "We are stepping away from the shores of everything that has numbed and distracted and kept us small, pushing off into the great river, a river that is within, that may restore our original goodness and wholeness, that we may be reminded of who we are." Well, the point is, we have a great heritage on the Salish Sea of people who lived in harmony and concert with the land and the water for 10,000 years and still do. And they live in a sacred way as much as one can in this century and certainly leading up to this time. And we benefit and we bless the land by remembering that and bringing it to our own work. So even before we finish here tonight, I hope to see, you know, a moment where we can do that together. But we want to examine our roots first, and probably 90%, 95% of the people in the room know of roots that came from some other place. It's where our ancestors are buried. That's really where we begin to find our roots. So that's very few of us who are, you know, here tonight in Jefferson County. So we want to learn from other people who have that heritage. You know, the people who lived on Oak Bay. Oak Bay was what you passed as you were coming over the isthmus to Narrowstone Island. You passed a row of oak trees just before you reached the isthmus, and those are the only native Gary oaks that were here when Vancouver sailed in 1792 and started to change all the names and map everything. And they saw the oak trees there, called it Oak Bay. Now there's oak trees coming up here and there around the county because people are seeing that as an important piece of the heritage. It's setting context for native prairie, for medicinal plants, edible plants that grow in the matrix of the prairie. And so we want to shelter that prairie with some oak trees. So that's what's beginning to happen. That's the revegetation after the 150 years of settlement and colonization. My theme is that we need to add to our template in order to practice permaculture, the plants that were here before we arrived. That it's interesting, but it's not sufficient to say, well, I took some plants from Europe, some plants from South America, some plants from Asia, some plants from Australia, and I put that together and I call it the way I do permaculture. But we have to look for right where we are, because there's so many plants here of benefit, of use. And if we don't practice that culture, it becomes lost. So for example, one of the first things I learned when I arrived here, which was around 1970, I took a basket weaving class. I was living in Seattle, and I was just so fortunate to discover a class that a Haida woman was teaching And she taught us how to strip the leaves of cattails and bulrushes and just grasses that I would overlook. I wouldn't even, it took me years to even recognize one grass from another. But at least I learned their function initially. And so that becomes part of what I need to learn in order to be cultural here. Horticultural, permacultural, multicultural. It really is about culture. It's about language, too. It's the rhododendron more than any other. Although it's the state flower of Washington, Pacific rhododendron, is also the flower that we celebrate in our Rhododendron Festival every May. This picture was taken in Port Townsend, right after the Rhododendron Parade, actually, about 2 or 3 years ago. So here's another little philosophical piece. This comes from Matthew Hall, a book that was just published last year, and it's called Plants as Persons. In many ways, restoration is a way of enacting our knowledge of plant personhood and human-plant kinship. It can point us in the direction of ritual, of embodied performed activity, of apology for centuries of domination. Dialogically oriented restorative action is a collaboration between human beings and plants to recreate, as closely as possible, wild and free living ecosystems. So just out of all that, I won't read it again, but I would have you remember the words wild and free living ecosystems, because that's what we approximate in permaculture design, except it's not really wild. So by adding native plants to the mix, we're making a further step across that invisible boundary between domestic and wild. The history of Western civilization arriving on the Salish Sea is of domination, kind of gentle compared to a lot of other places, so we don't have a lot of battlefield sites here. The battle was pretty much over when we got here, but still domination, subjugation of the land. And you can just look across from here to Whidbey Island and get that picture, because one of the only battles that was fought here was right over there in Eby Prairie, just opposite where we are here at Fort Flagler, by Fort Casey and beyond. And there were camas fields by the mile, a mecca for tribes from all over the region to come and dig roots and for food and medicine. And along came the settlers, and Eby being a prominent name amongst them, and said, well, we have a different idea here. And the manner in which they would subjugate the land is another example right here. If you came through Port Townsend or went there today, you passed through a place called Station Prairie, only it's known to most of us as the Jefferson County International Airport, which was the last unpaved international airport in the United States until 1991. When the FAA gave us some money, we paved the airport and cut down about 200 acres of trees in order to meet their requirements. But that was a prairie. It was a burnt prairie in the early 1850s and prior. The local tribes would come there, and on some interval, let's say 4 or 5 years, they would burn off the incipient woody growth, things that creep in around the edges. It wasn't Scotch broom in those days. It was more like native blackberry and ocean spray and things like that, to open the habitat up again for regeneration from the roots that were in the matrix of the prairie. And that's things like chocolate lily, camas, lomatium, food plants and medicine plants of the prairie. So what happened? There was an open clearing there, probably the only one for miles, because it was a maintained prairie. So the soldiers came and they built their stockade there, and to protect the settlers from any, people who were outraged about their prairie being taken away from them. And became a fort temporarily. Later the fort moved a few miles away, but by that time there were no angry natives. The prairie basically disappeared, and the method by which prairies disappeared was the plow and the pig. So once the soil was turned, settlers would plant potatoes, which is an easy crop to keep clean, that is to weed and manage out anything that wasn't a potato. And then finally they would run their pigs over it to dig out any roots that were still in the soil, and that's why the camas disappeared so completely and so quickly from most of western Washington. In my research, I found approximately 80 prairie sites in western Washington. Only a few of them are semi-intact today, like Mima Mounds, but we have them here in Jefferson County. And those are the roots of the heritage. That's what I was talking about a few minutes ago. That's where we want to look for plants to add to our permaculture template, so we can be uniquely Northwest, be uniquely Olympian habitats and watersheds as we create new permaculture landscapes.